Step into a world of romance and mystery with Tamora Rose. Today we're reading Chapter 2 of Child of the Wind. Merciful silence would not come no matter how much they prayed for it. The baby had been crying for hours. She apparently didn't take well to traveling. A wet nurse attended her constantly, but that didn't seem to comfort the little mite. Is she ever going to shut up? Edward asked, glancing behind them at the carriage that held the infant and her nurse. No, his father replied. That baby is determined to scream until we all run mad. And we're stuck with her forever? The very idea repelled him. Alan sighed. It's a good thing for us. I might be a duke, and you may be my heir, but next to Barsland we're bare paupers. By betrothing her to your brother, the king has ensured her safety and our continued good fortune. You mean Jet's good fortune. He'll get her money when they wed. And the king has even decreed that he'll get the title. That might have rankled Edward just a little, but since one day he would be Duke of Surfolk, well, he didn't mind that his brother would be an earl. He did mind the money. He wanted the money. He'd have betrothed her to you, but you're to wed Nora. And since Edward had already bedded the girl, he really had to marry her, or her father would have something to say about the matter. I'd rather have Nora than that little baggage. Canace chose that moment to shriek like a feral cat, proving Edward's point. I wish Jet joy of her, Edward muttered. Alan couldn't help but laugh. We really should have brought Mac with us. He seemed to quiet the little one with relative ease. He said he'd visit before he returned to Scotland. Hopefully that visit will be sooner rather than later. Another shriek, this one even louder and angrier than the last, echoed through the air, making Edward flinch. She'll grow out of it, the Duke assured his son. You did. I was never that loud. Of course you were. And if you remember Jet, he howled like a banshee day and night. I was only 7, but I remember that. The Duke nodded at the memory. But he did eventually grow out of it. Just like you did. And Canace will as well. When? Soon. For some reason, that did not make Edward feel any better. Alan watched as his wife kissed the baby before laying her in the crib. Little Canace had taken a liking to his lovely wife, so she was quiet and content, for the moment. He expected the baby to start screaming again shortly, but to his great surprise, the baby only went to sleep. How did you do that? He whispered as his wife walked towards him. They exited the newly furnished nursery and moved down the hall. Rosemary laughed softly. Babies aren't as difficult as you men seem to think they are. All they need is love, warmth, and a healthy wet nurse. With one arm draped around her waist, he led her toward their shared bedchamber. As he opened the door and ushered her inside, he heard her sigh. What's wrong? He asked as he unfastened the back of her gown. Rosemary turned to face him as her gown slithered to the floor. I already love that baby, but she makes me sad, too. Why sad? He reached for the ribbons holding her shift in place. Her smile was without its usual sparkle. She reminds me that I haven't been able to give you another child. Not in 10 years. His hungry eyes moved over her naked flesh. You've given me 2 strong sons and a beautiful little daughter. That's enough for any man. I would have liked to give you more. As his hands touched her heated skin, her head fell back and all thought was driven from her mind. Alan's lips brushed her ear. Maybe we can fix that. It was well after midnight when Rosemary suddenly jerked upright in bed. Alan, ever aware of his wife's movements, woke immediately. What? He asked. Her eyes were fixed on the door. I don't know. Something was wrong, she was sure of it. A cold finger of dread curled around her heart, urging her to her feet. The Duchess threw back the covers and jumped out of bed. She was already rushing toward the door when Alan realized she was totally without clothes. Rosemary! Alan climbed out of bed, grabbed her dressing gown from the back of a nearby chair, and raced after her. You're not running around naked in the middle of the night. She shoved her arms into the dressing gown and tied it on the run. Alan almost darted after her before realizing he was also naked. Muttering a curse, the Duke turned around to search for his own dressing gown. When he was covered, he left the room in search of his wife. He had only just started down the hall when a scream echoed through the manor. Rosemary. It had been Rosemary's scream, and it had come from the nursery. Thoughts of his wife and the infant sleeping down the hall sent him flying. Unarmed and unprepared, he entered the nursery. His wife was against the wall, pinned there by a man dressed all in black. Alan didn't hesitate. With a low growl, he threw himself at the intruder, knocking the man sideways. Together, they tumbled over each other until the man in black was on top. A flash of silver was the only warning he had. Alan brought his arm up just in time to keep the blade from his neck. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw his wife rush to the crib and scoop up the baby right before she ran out of the room screaming. As she did, Alan felt the knife dip closer to his neck. Footsteps sounded in the hall, footsteps that couldn't have arrived at a better time. The man on top of him was heavy and strong, much stronger than he was. The blade was mere inches from his throat and getting closer with every passing second. Men rushed into the room, all with blades drawn. The man in black had only a second to decide. He could kill the Duke or he could try to run. Like most cowards, he tried to run. The man jumped up and raced for the open window. The Duke's men followed, climbing out onto the roof in an effort to apprehend the intruder. Alan, who could never stand not seeing what was happening, found his feet and rushed for the window. While he wasn't actually going to crawl around on the roof in his dressing gown, he could at least watch his men capture the trespasser. Answers were near at hand, or so he thought. His men had chased the interloper to the very edge of the roof. Just when he was sure they had him, the man moved to the edge, looked back over his shoulder for a pregnant moment, and jumped. The Duke brought his head down heavily on the window ledge in frustration. They were on the 3rd floor. It was highly unlikely that the man would have survived that fall. "Edward!" the Duke shouted as he spun around, only to see his son stumble into the nursery, slightly drunk and thoroughly disheveled. "Tuck your shirt in and go find out if that man is still alive." "What man?" his son slurred. "Just get out there!" Edward nodded and stumbled back out of the nursery. The Duke shook his head in exasperation before heading off to find his wife. He had to be sure she was all right. When he pushed open the bedchamber door, the wet nurse was feeding young Canace under the watchful gaze of his worried wife. "Is the baby all right?" he asked softly as he closed the door. Rosemary regarded him with a shaky smile as she moved toward him. "She wasn't hurt. I entered the nursery as he was reaching for her. When I screamed, he turned on me." "In your opinion, was he going to kill her or steal her?" It might seem odd to ask a woman her opinion on such matters, but he'd learned years ago that his wife possessed a keen instinct when it came to those she cared about. "He was definitely going to kidnap her," Rosemary answered immediately. "If he'd wanted to kill her, he would have done so before I got there." With a sigh, he wrapped her in his arms. "You could have been killed. I would have been if you hadn't followed me." With great care, he took her face in his hands. "Don't ever do anything like that again." She smiled, but didn't answer him, telling him she'd damn well do it again if she had one of her feelings. He sighed and dropped his hands. "I have to get dressed and see if we can identify the man who did this. Look after the little one and get some sleep." She nodded. Alan only shook his head and went to find his breeches. "I don't have any idea who he is," Edward sighed as he rubbed his eyes. The sun was just peeking above the horizon, and he was tired, and still just a little drunk. His father echoed his sigh and kicked the boot of the dead man. Neither does anyone else. All he had was the knife and a mouthful of poison. "So we couldn't even interrogate him," Edward sighed. "Even I know that means there will be more of them." Alan nodded and turned away, heading slowly back to the manor. It was quite clear that Canais would continue to be targeted until she was either dead or a prisoner of whoever was orchestrating this whole thing. The worst of it was, they would eventually succeed. Oh, he could protect her, assign men to guard her, but ultimately, if they kept coming, the baby would be taken. The enemy only had to get lucky once. He and his men had to be perfect each and every time. Not possible. So what was he to do with the girl? He could go to the king, but he was loath to put the child in the king's keeping. Henry might protect her for a time, but even the king's men weren't perfect, and the king wasn't nearly as motivated as Alan and his family. They actually cared what happened to Canais. Henry did not. A rider appeared on the horizon, causing Alan to hasten his steps and call out to nearby men. A lone rider was probably no threat, but it wasn't worth the risk. He'd have his men on alert. The manor boasted a wall thick enough to keep out the casual intruder, but it hadn't made much difference last night when the dead man had been sneaking about the manor. He considered the possibility that the rider was a distraction. Immediately his gaze moved across the distant horizon, searching for other riders. He even called out for his men to surround the manor, just in case an attack came from a different direction. Several tense minutes passed before the lone rider was close enough to call out his identity. As soon as the familiar voice drifted through the gate, Alan let out the breath he hadn't known he was holding. "Mac!" he shouted back. "Get in here!" The Scotsman slid off his horse. What happened here? Why so many men? "Come inside." The Duke led the way into the manor and strode immediately to the nearest parlor. Once there, he ordered drinks be brought, then lapsed into silence. Mac waited until he was comfortably seated with a brandy in hand. "Tell me," he said quietly. It all came out in a rush. Alan described the intruder, his wife's intuition, their increased security. He also detailed their frustration in not knowing who was behind this. Finally, he revealed his mounting insecurities. He knew damn well he couldn't keep the baby safe forever. With a deceptively calm shrug, the Scotsman offered an immediate solution. "Give her to me." "What?" The Duke couldn't keep the surprise out of his voice. Mac only grinned and put aside his brandy. "I may be one of the king's favorites, but even he knows relatively little about me. Even you don't know where I was born." "Scotland," Alan answered immediately. "Ah, but which part of Scotland?" The burly Scot leaned back in his chair. "It's a vast country." Alan sighed. "I really have no idea. And neither does anyone else. I'm heading home after my visit here is concluded. I can take the lass with me. No one need know. She can live in Scotland under my mother's care until you catch those trying to harm her, or until she is old enough to marry your son, whichever comes first." The Duke sat back and thought about that. He hated to give the girl up, even temporarily, but he had to admit that the idea solved the immediate problem. If Canais was safely in Scotland, he and his men could focus on finding those responsible for Garrick's death. Once they had caught the perpetrators and turned them over to the king, Canais could return to England. It was a neat enough solution, and if he had to place the child with anyone, Mac was the best choice. A more honorable man he'd never met, and he had been one of Garrick's closest friends. He looked Mac in the eye. "You'll bring her back when it's safe?" "Either then or when she's 15, Mac grinned again. "Can't have her miss her own wedding." Alan was already shaking his head. "It won't take 15 years to catch the beast behind the slaughter. If I have my way, she'll be back here in 6 months. If you can ensure her safety, I will certainly bring her back," the Scot promised. "You can send a message through the king. He knows how to reach me." Knowing this man could be trusted above all others, Alan nodded. "You can tell my wife she has to give up the baby." A bark of laughter filled the room. "I make it my business never to cross a woman as sensitive as Rosemary. You tell her." The Duke almost flinched. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this chapter, tell me in the comments below which part was your favorite. Until we meet again, may your days be filled with passion and just a touch of magic.